By the end of this video, you will know all of the theoretical candidates to be the RB1 in fantasy football, as well as who I personally think will be the RB1. Please remember to like and subscribe. Let's get into it. So the past 5 RB1s are Christian McCaffrey in 2019, Alvin Kamara in 2020, Jonathan Taylor in 2021, Austin Eckler in 2022, and this past season it was Christian McCaffrey for a second time. So what we're going to focus on in this video specifically is all-purpose yards, carries and receptions combined, and total touchdowns. What you will notice out of all of these players is that each one of them had at least 1,637 all-purpose yards. Austin Eckler had the least. 270 carries and receptions. Alvin Kamara had the least. And 18 touchdowns, in which Eckler had the least. One other thing is most of these running backs also had at least 83 targets, and 3 out of the 5 had at least 100. The one player that's kind of an anomaly here is Jonathan Taylor. His season is what, say, in 2005 you would expect for the RB1. So generally, you do need to have more targets than not, but players like Jonathan Taylor could still be the RB1. So those were the low marks that every one of these players hit. On average, though, they had 1,982 all-purpose yards, 339 carries and receptions, and 19.8, which we will round up to 20 touchdowns. So what we're going to do is look at players that can post at least 1,637 all-purpose yards, 270 carries and receptions, and 18 touchdowns, but also players that could hit the general average of 1,982 all-purpose yards, 339 carries and receptions, and 20 touchdowns. So the first running back on this list is Christian McCaffrey of the San Francisco 49ers. This past season, he was the RB1, averaging 24.5 fantasy points per game. One fun fact, in all but 2 seasons of his career, he has averaged over 20 fantasy points per game. So in his rookie year, he had 14.3, then he stepped it up to 24.1, then in his third year, it spiked to 29.3. Now, he only played 3 games in the next season, but he did average 30.1. Then it dipped to 18.2. Then in 2022, he had 21. And this past season, he had 24.5. He has been one of the most consistently dominant running backs in recent memory and is the ultimate dual threat running back. When we think about his situation, it's as advantageous as it gets. First of all, he has Kyle Shanahan as his head coach, an offensive genius. Then he's surrounded by a solid quarterback in Brock Purdy, elite wide receiver talent in Brandon Ayuk and Deebo Samuel, as well as first-round pick Ricky Pearsall, and an elite tight end in George Kittle. This is going to be one of the most efficient offenses in the NFL, and at least for one more season, he projects to be an elite running back 1 for us. So Christian McCaffrey is 5'11", 202 pounds, which does give him a 28.2 BMI, which is under the 30.0 general threshold for being a bell cow, but he's been a bell cow his entire career, really. Now, he is 28.2 years old, and historically, 28 is the last season, historically at least, that a running back will have a peak production season. So it's probably a make-it-or-break-it year. When we look at his metrics, he's, besides the bench press, across the board, much better than average. His 272 carries this past season were second. His 83 targets were fourth. His 79 red zone touches were first. His 21 total touchdowns were first. His 67 receptions were third. His weighted opportunities was first in the NFL. He finished first with 1,459 rushing yards, second with 564 receiving yards, a 34.6 dominator rating, which is his market share of the team's yards and touchdowns, which was good for fourth. He finished with 1,287 yards created, which was first, and 3.8 yards created per touch, which was 13th. Then when you look at his true yards per carry, his 4.9 was good for 5th in the NFL. His 6.0 yards per touch was good for 3rd. His 22.7 juke rate was good for 13th. He finished with 77 evaded tackles, which was good for 1st. His 7.4 breakaway run rate was good for 4th. And his 20 total breakaway runs was also 1st. So once again, he is in a fantastic offense. He's also one of, if not the most talented running backs in the NFL. I think you could debate him or potentially another running back that I'm going to mention later. But we've already seen him be the RB1 twice in his career, so obviously he is a candidate here. And when we look at the all-purpose yards, carries and receptions combined, and touchdowns from each of the past 5 seasons RB1, when we look at the low metrics for each season, they at least had 1,637 all-purpose yards. Well, this past season he had 2023, so he definitely exceeded that. They had 270 carries and receptions at least. Well, he had 339, so he exceeded that. And then they had at least 18 touchdowns. Well, his 21 this past season exceeded that. So he hit the minimum threshold for all of these. When we look at the average of 1,982 all-purpose yards was beat by 2023. He had 2023 and 2023. Then the average of 339 carries and catches, he literally had the average. Then 19.8 touchdowns, which we would round up to 20 for the average. He had 21. So he met or exceeded each one of these thresholds on average as well. This guy is a serious candidate to be the RB1 this year. So the next running back on this list is Breece Hall of the New York Jets. This past season, he was the RB2, averaging 17.1 fantasy points per game. So in his 2 seasons, he's averaged 16.4 and then 17.1 fantasy points per game. This guy's a dual threat at the running back position. You'll notice a theme here. When we think about his situation, he lost Aaron Rodgers 4 snaps into the season this past year. That doomed this offense. It was up to Zach Wilson. Well, now he has Aaron Rodgers coming back. He has Garrett Wilson to take some of the attention off the running game because now they'll actually be able to pass or something. So he projects to be much, much higher in fantasy points per game this next season. So Breece Hall's 5'11", 217 pounds with a 30.3 BMI, so above the 30.0 threshold to be a bell cow. He's been a bell cow most of his career. Now he's 23.2 years old, and now he's going to be 2 years removed from that ACL tear. When you look at his metrics, he is as elite as it gets, and his speed score, his actual 40-yard dash, and his burst score. So when we look at his past season, his 223 carries were good for 14th, his 95 targets were good for 1st, his 29 red zone touches were good for 33rd. To contextualize that though, it was pretty hard for the Jets to go anywhere with Zach Wilson or worse at quarterback. Then his 9 total touchdowns were good for 12th. Once again, it's hard to get there. And most of his touchdowns were of the long variety. That's just about the only way they were going to score. His 283 weighted opportunities was good for 2nd. His 67 receptions was good for 3rd. His 994 rushing yards was good for 13th. His 591 receiving yards were good for 1st. His 42.4% dominator rating, which is his market share of the yards and touchdowns, was 1st. He and Garrett Wilson were the offense. Then when you look at his yards created, his 1,166 were good for 3rd, and his yards created per play of 3.9 was good for 10th. His 3.9 true yards per carry, however, was good for 38th. Once again, it's really hard to create when you're not getting any blocking to begin with. His 5.3 yards per touch, however, was good for 11th. His 25.8 juke rate was good for 5th. His 77 evaded tackles were good for 1st. His 4.9% breakaway run rate was good for 14th, and his 11 total breakaway runs was also good for 11th. So this guy is elite, and he's going to be in a much better situation, like I said, because now they have Aaron Rodgers back. When we look at his season against the minimum thresholds, his 290 receptions and carries does beat out the 270 minimum. His 1,585 total yards does not meet the 1,637 minimum. And his 9 touchdowns definitely doesn't meet the 18 necessary. And then he didn't meet any of the average thresholds as well. I suspect this season, another year off the ACL tear with a much more efficient offense around him, he's going to dominate. So this guy is going to be an elite running back, and you have nothing to worry about, and he is absolutely a contender this season for the RB1 overall. The next player on this list is Bijan Robinson of the Atlanta Falcons. So he finished as the RB9 this past season, averaging 14.5 fantasy points per game. He was one of the most heralded running back prospects coming out of Texas. He was picked 8th overall. So what did Arthur Smith do? He put him in a timeshare with Tyler Algier. Isn't that great? I was very frustrated as an owner. Well, Arthur Smith is gone, so you can expect the offense to actually feature their star players now. They brought in the Ram scheme. If you know anything about Todd Gurley or Kyron Williams, you can expect great things for Bijan this season. The offense is going to be very efficient. They received 2 quarterback upgrades in Kirk Cousins and Michael Penix, so there should be some stability there. Listen, he is going to be elite this season. This guy is a multifunctional back. He's a fantastic route runner out of the backfield. He can make over-the-shoulder catches. He has one of, if not the nastiest juke move in the NFL. He is a complete back who is going to absolutely dominate this season. So the next running back that could theoretically be the RB1 is Bijan Robinson of the Atlanta Falcons. So he's 5'11", 215. That gives him a perfect 30.0 BMI. If Arthur Smith wasn't his head coach, he would have been a workhorse, and he's going to be this season. He's 22.5 years old, so he's going to be around for a long time. When we look at his metrics, he's above average in everything: 40-yard dash, speed score, and burst score. And his 214 carries were good for 19th. Once again, Arthur Smith made sure he was not a bell cow. His 86 targets, however, were good for 3rd. His 31 red zone touches were 32nd. Thank you, Arthur Smith. Let's put Tyler Algier in the game when it counts. His 8 total touchdowns, thanks to Arthur Smith, was 20th. His 58 receptions were good for 6th, however. His 263.4 weighted opportunities were good for 5th. His 976 rushing yards were good for 15th. His 487 receiving yards were good for 4th. His dominator rating of 25.3 was good for 16th. His 4.4 true yards per carry was good for 16th. His 5.4 yards per touch was good for 9th. His 23.2% juke rate was good for 11th. His 63 evaded tackles were good for 7th. His 4.7 breakaway run rate was good for 20th. And his 10 total breakaway runs were good for 15th. Then when we look at his yards created, his 1,041 was good for 5th in the NFL, and his 3.83 yards created per touch was good for 12th. So when we compare his total touches, total all-purpose yards, and touchdowns compared to the minimum thresholds, his 273 total touches does beat out the minimum threshold of 270. His 1,463 total yards does not meet the minimum threshold of 1,637. And his 8 touchdowns obviously does not meet the minimum threshold of 18. And as you can guess, none of these stats are going to meet the averages. However, he does have a serious chance this season. He is going to be a bell cow. It's going to be an incredibly efficient offense. It's going to be the Rams offense. And yeah, he's an elite player who's now going to be in an elite situation. So he's definitely a contender this season for the RB1 overall. So the next running back on this list is Jahmyr Gibbs of the Detroit Lions. This past season, he was the RB10 overall, averaging 16.1 fantasy points per game. This is thoroughly impressive considering he didn't do anything until week 7. However, when David Montgomery missed week 7 and 8, he averaged 28.75 fantasy points per game. He would have been the RB1 overall at that rate. And while that is a small sample size, that just goes to show in this offense how elite any one of these running backs can be if they're the only one. This offense is going to be one of the most efficient offenses in the NFL. He's surrounded by elite talent everywhere. Amon-Ra St. Brown is one of the premier wide receivers. Sam Laporta was the tight end 1 as a rookie. Jared Goff isn't a rushing threat at all. It's perfect. And he, in my opinion, has the best offensive line in football, along with one of, if not potentially, the best offensive coordinators in Ben Johnson. This is an elite situation, and if David Montgomery, his running back mate, misses any time, this guy is going to dominate, and he's still going to be elite regardless. So Jahmyr Gibbs is 5'9", 199. That does give him a 29.4 BMI, which is below the minimum threshold of 30, and he isn't used as a featured back when David Montgomery is healthy. When he isn't, though, he is used as a featured back. He's nowhere near too old for us to worry about his production this season. When you look at his 40-yard dash and speed score, they're both elite. His 182 carries was good for 28th. His 71 targets was good for 8th. His 42 red zone touches was 15th. His 52 receptions were 9th. His 11 total touchdowns were also 9th. His 945 rushing yards was good for 17th. His 316 receiving yards was good for 16th. His .96 fantasy points per opportunity were 8th. His 220.7 weighted opportunities was good for 16th. His 4.8 true yards per carry was good for 7th. His 5.4 yards per touch was good for 8th. His 23.9% juke rate was good for 9th. His 56 total evaded tackles was good for 13th. His 8.2 breakaway run rate was good for 2nd, and his 15 total breakaway runs was good for 3rd. Now, his 823 yards created was only 24th, and his yards created per play of 3.52 was also only 22nd. So he didn't necessarily create as much on his own, but he still has an elite juke rate, yards per touch, true yards per carry, and breakaway run rates. So he's still a fantastic player. So to save some time, he was brought along slowly and really didn't do anything until week 7. So none of his total touches, yards, or touchdowns met the minimum thresholds or averages, but he wasn't used really until week 7. So after this season, we'll have a better idea if he can meet these thresholds. I do believe in him personally because he is an exceptional running back, and in my opinion, he is absolutely a threat to be the RB1 this year. The next running back on this list is Saquon Barkley of the Philadelphia Eagles. He signed with the Eagles this offseason to a 3-year deal that projects to probably be 2. Look, he's been stuck in the least advantageous situation imaginable for running backs, the Giants. Their offense, besides him, has been incapable of doing anything really since his rookie season. He's suffered horrible quarterback play, and just the offense besides him has been talent deficient everywhere, including his offensive line. It was atrocious. When we look at his fantasy points per game in his career, he had 24 as a rookie, then he had 18.8. Now in his 3rd year, he only played 2 games, and he did have 7.7, but that's a blip on the radar. Then he had 11.4, 17.8, and 15.9 this past season. This guy is now on the Eagles. They have one of the best offensive lines in the NFL. They have premier talent everywhere. It's going to be an incredibly efficient offense, and he is going to be elite this season. So Saquon Barkley is 6 foot 233, and that gives him a 31.6 BMI. He's 27.5 years old, so he is below the general age of 28, where a running back is going to have their last good season. And when you look at his metrics, they're all elite. His 247 carries was good for 8th. His 60 targets was 15th. His 46 red zone touches was good for 9th. His 41 receptions was good for 20th. His 10 total touchdowns was good for 11th. His 15.1 run block rating, though, once again, I mentioned his offensive line was terrible, was 57th. That's how bad it is. Leading to 62 stuffed runs, which was 2nd in the NFL. Once again, it was the worst situation imaginable, and that hurt every single one of these other stats. His 962 rushing yards was 16th. His 280 receiving yards was good for 20th. His 242.4 weighted opportunities was good for 9th. His 3.7 true yards per carry was good for 51st. Once again, not his fault. His 4.3 yards per touch was good for 42nd. His 14.6% juke rate was good for 48th. His 42 evaded tackles was good for 21st. His 4.9 breakaway run rate was good for 15th, and his 12 total breakaway runs was good for 8th. Then his yards created of 847 was 18th, and his 2.94 yards created per touch was good for 46th. So once again, his situation was terrible in New York. Now he finds himself in Philadelphia with one of the best run blocking O-lines there is. He's going to ball out this season. So when we take a look at his total touches, yards, and touchdowns from this past season, the only one that met one of the minimum thresholds was his 288 total touches. The minimum threshold was 270. So once again, this season he has a real opportunity to meet at least the minimum thresholds here and potentially meet the averages. He did have 2,000 plus total yards as a rookie. So we know that he is capable of being the RB1, and he literally was the RB1 that season. He is a real threat to be the RB1 this year. The next running back on this list is Kyren Williams of the Los Angeles Rams. This past season, he was the RB7, averaging 21.3 fantasy points per game. So in his rookie season, he averaged 3.4. So nobody saw this coming. By the way, he was number 2 in fantasy points per game this past season. The Rams are one of the best offenses for running backs. They usually use only one running back, and the scheming is so wonderful that it makes defenses really struggle to stack the box against them. And Kyren Williams is one of the most technically sound running backs there is. He is one of the worst athletes I've ever seen at the running back position by NFL standards. Personally, I liked his tape at Notre Dame, but once I saw his combine, I didn't take him anywhere, and that was a big mistake. This guy is going to be absolutely dominant this season. The only issue potentially is they did draft Blake Corum, so we may have to worry about somewhat of a timeshare. But historically, Sean McVay has only used one running back, so I do expect Kyren Williams, unless he gets hurt, to generally dominate the touches this season. So Kyren Williams is 5'9", 194 with a 28.6 BMI, so below the 30.0 minimum threshold, generally at least, to be a bell cow. He was used as a bell cow this past season, although there was no one else in the running back room that was talented, really. He does have to deal with Blake Corum, but he's still only 24 years old. One thing, though, looking at his metrics, he has a 30th percentile 40-yard dash, a 9th percentile speed score, a 20th percentile burst score, and a 51st percentile agility score. So once again, one of the worst athletic profiles, at least, I've ever seen at the running back position. His 228 carries were good for 13th. His 48 targets were good for 24th. His 60 red zone touches were good for 4th. His 32 receptions were 28th. His 15 touchdowns, however, were good for 3rd. His 212.2 weighted opportunities were 20th. His 1,144 rushing yards were good for 3rd, with 206 receiving yards, which was good for 32nd. His 4.8 true yards per carry was good for 8th. His 5.2 yards per touch was good for 13th. His 23.5% juke rate was good for 10th. His 61 evaded tackles were good for 8th. His 3.9% breakaway run rate, however, was good for 28th. And his 9 total breakaway runs was good for 20th. So his total touches, all-purpose yards, and touchdowns, none of those did meet the minimum thresholds, but he did miss some time. For instance, his 260 total touches were only 10 off. Then he did have 15 total touchdowns, so very close to the 18. If he had played all of the games this past season, I think he would have met the minimum thresholds. And he was challenging Christian McCaffrey for the RB1 overall in points per game. He absolutely is a threat to be the RB1. So a couple of honorable mentions who I just think are a little bit less likely than the running backs I've previously mentioned are Derrick Henry of the Baltimore Ravens. He is going to be in a fantastic offense, and he is my dark horse candidate to be the RB1. He doesn't have the receiving upside that a lot of the other running backs have, but he's a workhorse. He is, however, over 30 years old now, so any time now he could break down, but he's going to score a lot of rushing touchdowns with Lamar Jackson next to him. Then we have Travis Etienne. He's coming off an RB3 season. He is a candidate. I just don't think their offensive line is generally good enough for him to meet the total yards, but he is going to receive the touches, and he is a threat for the touchdowns. Just a little bit less likely, I think, than some of the other candidates. Jonathan Taylor has been the RB1 before. However, the past 2 seasons, he hasn't finished anywhere close to that. And with Anthony Richardson there, I think he's going to vulture a lot of touchdowns. I just don't think this offense is going to be quite as efficient as Baltimore's is, so I do think his touchdown ceiling is going to be a little bit more capped than Derrick Henry's is, but he could still reach double-digit touchdowns. Then you have Devon Achane. He is one of the most explosive per-touch running backs that there is. However, with him being so small and with them drafting Jalen Wright and trading up to get him, along with having Raheem Mostert, it's going to be a 3-headed committee, in my opinion, at the running back position, which without the touches is going to make it really hard. He's going to have to remain historically efficient to be the RB1, so pretty unlikely, but he potentially could do it if he stays healthy the entire season and there's an injury to one or both of the other running backs, but he's never going to be a featured back. Then we have Josh Jacobs. He finds himself in Green Bay, the first offense that he's been a part of that's actually projected to be good. He's going to be a bell cow most likely, and he's still not even 27 years old. So while he is on a second contract, it's the best situation he's ever been in. So I do think that he is a threat for the RB1 overall. I just don't think he's quite as talented as some of these other running backs. And there is a chance that they use somewhat of a committee with Marshawn Lloyd, who they drafted out of USC, who's really talented. Then you have Alvin Kamara. Now, he did finish third in points per game this past season, and he has been one of the more elite running backs, including he did have an RB1 finish in his career. He is declining as a rusher, though, while remaining as an elite receiver. So if he gets a lot of touchdowns this season and is used extensively as a receiver and remains healthy, there's an outside chance that he's the RB1. I just wouldn't project it with him looking a little bit worse this past season rushing the ball and potentially looking worse than he did this past season in that regard. But he is generally going to be the bell cow there. So I think that these are good honorable mentions, and once again, Derrick Henry is my dark horse RB1 candidate. So I think that Breece Hall is going to be the RB1 this season. I think that McCaffrey is set to decline maybe this season, and Breece Hall is going into the best situation that he's going to have been in his 3-year career. He is, in my opinion, the most talented running back in the NFL. Now, he isn't as good of a receiver as Christian McCaffrey, but I think he's a better runner of the football. So with Aaron Rodgers coming back, the offense is going to be incredibly efficient. And when we think about running backs in an Aaron Rodgers offense, Aaron Jones, who isn't as talented as Breece Hall is, was able to have 4 top 10 seasons, including 2 top 5 seasons at the running back position. And Breece Hall already finished as the RB2 while being in just about the worst offense in the NFL. His touchdowns are going to go way up. His yards are going to go way up. And he doesn't even really need to have more volume. So Breece Hall is one of the most talented running backs in the NFL. He is one of the best running backs at using speed deceptively to create bad angles for defenders. He has a nasty juke move. He has one of the best, in my opinion, actually, the best spin move in the NFL. He can use speed to power. He is one of the best receiving backs. And now he's going to be in an offense that is going to be much, much, much more productive and efficient. So I think that he's going to present us with massive upside. Because once again, he was the RB2 in the worst offense just about in the NFL. But what do you think? Do you agree that Breece Hall is going to be the RB1 this season? Do you think it's McCaffrey, Bijan? Who is your choice for the RB1 this season? Please let me know in the comment section and let me know why. Please remember to like and subscribe. I would love to continue doing these videos. Thank you and have a good day.